Hello all, welcome. I want to welcome you to this SouthTalk, which is the final Wednesday afternoon SouthTalk of the semester. Today's SouthTalk continues this exploration of LGBTQ plus life in both the present and in the past by examining William Faulkner's Enduring Queerness. Pip Gordon is a visiting assistant professor of gender studies in the Sarah Isom Center for Women and Gender Studies here at the University of Mississippi. He has returned to the South after nearly a decade as an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin, Platteville, where he was also LGBTQ studies coordinator and a 2018 recipient of the UW System's PB Poorman Award for contributions to LGBTQ visibility. Many of you know about Pip's work, but if you don't know about Pip's work, all you have to do is go to Square Books, walk up the stairs, go to the Faulkner section. In the back right corner, everybody should know where the Faulkner section is. You stand there, you'll see the set of Faulkner Library of America books, you'll see the Faulkner vintage books, you'll see 20 years, 30 years, 50 years of Faulkner scholarship there, and you won't miss, with the rainbow Roanoke cover here, Pip's book, Gay Faulkner, Uncovering a Homosexual Presence in Yoknapatawpha and Beyond. That's exactly the kind of intervention that Pip's book announced and disrupted in the world of Faulkner studies, to inquire what the biographical Faulkner can tell us about the queerness that permeates his work and permeated his world of Oxford, Mississippi. Pip Gordon with Faulkner's Enduring Queerness.
All right, thank you all very much. I'm actually wearing a new friendship bracelet made by one of my students. It's a nice little queer-themed Gay Faulkner bracelet. I'm trying to embarrass a student who may be on the front row. Anyway, thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Andy, for it was a kind introduction, by the way. It's actually in the notes already. Thank for kind introduction. And thank you, Afton, for the very generous invitation to speak here today. And of course, thank you to your whole team who organizes these events. Make sure they all come together very well. And of course, thank you for everybody here in the audience today. My understanding is that there were a couple of poo-poo faces on Facebook when this was announced, and I just love that. I'm glad it didn't scare any of you away. We're gonna queer up the Barnard Observatory, so just be prepared. I don't know. But anyway, I myself have been in the audience for several of these SouthTalks this year as I've been returned to campus, and everyone I've attended has been wonderful, brilliant, insightful. I feel some pressure after having attended them to try to live up to the extraordinary mantle of excellent scholarship we've seen here this year. I will do my best. But admittedly, I'm being selfish in my approach to this talk today. In preparing it, I found myself much more focused on just Gay Faulkner, per my now 4-year-old book, than on the trans and ace approaches to Faulkner that I had originally intended when I first proposed this talk back in January, and which are developing ideas in my current, we'll say, Faulknerian aspirations. If there's time in the Q&A, I can expand on that more. I also, to be frank, haven't had tons of opportunities just to talk about this 4-year-old book since its publication because of the unique nature of its publication history. So the front materials for Gay Faulkner, Uncovering a Homosexual Presence in Yoknapatawpha and Beyond, list its publication date as 2019, but the precise date of publication was December 30th, 2019. The next day, as some of you may recall, Chinese officials informed the World Health Organization that there was this new respiratory infection spreading around China, having likely originated in a market in Wuhan. Undeterred as I was, because I was at that point completely uninformed of what was about to happen in this country, I was busily, at that point, planning my upcoming spring semester, which included a 2-week book tour scheduled for here in Mississippi in mid-March 2020. About a week before that tour began, the WHO on March 11th declared a global pandemic. By then, of course, most of the events that I had scheduled had been either postponed or outright canceled. After that declaration, what few remaining events were still on schedule were canceled as well. But I can't really complain. The events that were canceled or postponed eventually got rescheduled. I was supposed to be at the Mississippi Museums in late March of 2020. That talk got rescheduled for later on that summer on what happens to be the same day that the old state flag was ceremoniously delivered to the museums as a relic of history, they say. New opportunities have also blossomed in my research, including conference and keynote and panel presentations and opportunities that have helped me start thinking forward to my next and now ongoing projects on Faulkner. I have very little to complain about despite that sort of delay because of the pandemic, but I will offer as advice to any would-be authors in the room, where possible, try not to schedule publishing your book at the beginning of a global pandemic. It was no fun. Of course, there's kind of something rather satisfying in considering the proximity of publication and subsequent tour to these critical moments in the pandemic. Is it possible that Gay Faulkner is, in fact, a fifth horseman of the apocalypse? Am I the cause of all this drama? Are efforts to take Faulkner studies, indeed Southern studies, into these new queer directions simply abhorrent to the will of the universe? Oh, my queen, one does try to make an entrance on the academic stage. We all want to leave our mark on the world. Despite the better part of 2 decades that I have spent researching, then writing, and now living with this book, which is at this point old enough to be a toddler, I have not yet found a satisfactory way to reduce it to a short talk. But 4 years after its publication, I do have the advantage of numerous reviews and personal responses to the book to help frame what this project of queering Faulkner is and what, in the largest sense, I hope that it can be. Starting with these reviews today to introduce the project will prove helpful because really, when people feel like they can speak frankly to me about this book when they hear its title, the most common question that I am asked is always some version of, oh, Gay Faulkner, interesting. So, tell me, how has that, been received? The questioner's tone often signals their tolerance of, acceptance of, or disturbance caused by the loves and lives that dare not speak our own name. My answers tend to vary depending on the context. Like at a bar in Wisconsin, I usually tell people I wrote a book about William Faulkner in the Cold War and leave it at that. But here today, I promise I shall answer that question as truthfully as I can in gratitude for this invitation. And I will start my talk today with the recent review from May of 2023, not of my book, mind you, but of another new title in Faulkner studies titled Faulkner the Southerner by a man named James E. Kibler. To amplify his praise for Dr. Kibler's book, the reviewer in this case, a man named Patrick Say, identified as an independent historian from Virginia, writes the following in his opening paragraph. Every year sees the publication of tomes dedicated to examining the world of Yoknapatawpha in a new light, offering fresh perspectives and interpretations that all too often end up being shoddy attempts to relegate the author to the limiting dogmas of various ideological camps. Many, unfortunately, degenerate into mere sensationalism. One can see a recent example of this decadence in Phillip Gordon's Gay Faulkner, uncovering a homosexual presence in Yoknapatawpha and Beyond, the cover of which shows Roanoke behind its cedars and beneath a sky that has been superimposed by the now infamous rainbow. This may be an extreme example of the sorry state of Faulkner studies, but even among the best academic biographies that have been written on Faulkner, none seem to have adequately approached the factors that could help explain how brilliance could have emerged from a place and time such as Oxford, Mississippi, in the first half of the 20th century. I'm not trying to gloat or anything, but look, when somebody tells you they are the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, believe them. To be clear, Dr. Kibler's book is probably a quite excellent addition to studies of William Faulkner. I have not read it yet, but would very much enjoy the opportunity to do so. These are the opinions of a reviewer. They have absolutely nothing to do with the author of the book nor the book in question, Dr. Kibler's Faulkner the Southerner. But they do capture the inherent conservatism that surrounds the icons of the literary canon, and the desire of preservationists who want to maintain the most idyllic mythoi of the South and its most heralded voices. They express the kind of, potshot that scholars sometimes feel the need to take, rather than contend with the more important questions. What if we can explain the emergence of brilliance in the South precisely by the presence of queerness in it? Say's critique actually does stand out against what has been otherwise fairly universal good press for Gay Faulkner. In the first published review of the book from March of 2020 in the Clarion Ledger, Jesse Yancey offers these much, much kinder words. In a text, Gordon and other queer critics focus on the meaning and nuances of the words used and amplify their implications. Some readers may think Gordon is reaching to make a point, but in the end, the words and their meaning are there for anyone to understand. Gay Faulkner has a great deal to be recommended. It's interesting, educational, and yes, entertaining. It is a much-needed blade to cut the hidebound conventions surrounding Faulkner and his work. Not all readers have published their responses publicly. In late 2020, on a bright fall day when I was teaching from home during the shutdown, I received an email from a Faulkner scholar in Europe who had recently read my book. Here I will offer the concluding comments from that email. I've been reading Faulkner and Faulkner studies for over 40 years, fairly closely and very often. But your book has been the first that has really challenged how I look at Faulkner and how I judge my own ability to read. I've loved Faulkner since I was 19, but I've struggled to say exactly what it is that keeps me coming back to him. Your book has made me see that I was always reading about my life, myself, my hidden history. I've expressed that badly and will try better in another letter. Suffice it to say, your book moved me to tears, a kind of homecoming. I also still have voicemails from a retired professor in New York City from February of 2020, before any reviews had been published. He'd found the book at the Strand, read it in one day, and went to the trouble of tracking down my office phone number just to pay me the compliment of telling me how much he loved my work. But to offer what is probably the most common response to Gay Faulkner, I would turn to this review from Amazon.com, Obviously, I am quite flattered to hear the book described as captivating. But the second part of the blurb speaks to the disconnect that tends to trouble readers on their first encounter with the argument. What exactly is the book trying to convince readers of? So the phrase Gay Faulkner, as well as Queer Faulkner, the title of the most recent Faulkner and Yoknapatawpha conference from this last June of 2023, startle, because of the misconception that they intend to argue that Faulkner was gay or queer as a matter of his fixed identity, and therefore discussions held under these auspices, it follows, must be academic efforts to out him. If one approaches Gay Faulkner under the assumption that the book will argue for his secret homosexuality, you will leave disappointed, or at least find the argument less than convincing, since the argument does not, because it cannot, prove that point. To say Gay Faulkner or Queer Faulkner is not to demand that we identify him as gay or queer, but it is intended to challenge the equally tenuous presumption that he was a heterosexual, whatever the hell that means. And here I would pause to say that I have met a great many heterosexuals in my life in various places, and I have yet to find a consensus on what it means to be a heterosexual, except apparently it means to be, not gay, or at least not very often. But it is also more than just challenging the presumption of his heterosexuality or asking readers to stop seeing Faulkner as heterosexual. It is about asking readers to stop seeing Faulkner as heterosexuals themselves. It is about readers and our expectations. It is about the mythoi that arbitrate perceptions of what is plausible, acceptable, academic, and credible. It is about putting words to that which may be unspoken, but is most certainly known and knowable. Despite the massive bulk of Faulkner studies steadfastly marginalizing queerness in his works, the persistence of readers finding queerness in those works anyway may be, to me at least, the most enduring testament of his value as a writer. I doubt there has ever been a classroom full of students reading A Rose for Emily that didn't have at least one student willing to ponder, so what exactly does it mean that Homer Barron liked men? As laconically as possible. Gay Faulkner is the perspective that such a question is valid. And its answer can, in fact, offer insights beyond just the struggling interpretations of a novice reader learning to read. To be somewhat less laconic, I will define Gay Faulkner today in three ways: as an epistemology, as an archive, and most notably, as a limitation. That last way matters. It is the grounds from which grow trans and ace Faulkner studies, where I think Faulkner studies needs next to go. But after his somewhat grim commentary on the lamentable fate of Faulkner studies, represented by my little old book, Patrick Say continues with telling rhetoric about the way literary criticism can lean into the notion of acceptable lines of interpretation. He explains, fortunately for Faulkner's true audience, a new study, one that does not claim to offer novel, modern, or occurrent insights of his work, has proven that sensible criticism is far from moribund. If Gay Faulkner functions as an example of the sorry state of moribund Faulkner studies, then what mode of interpretation would he define as acceptable to Faulkner's true audience? And who is this true audience anyway? That he structures sensible criticism as opposed to claims of novelty, modern perspective, or occurrent insights would suggest that sensible criticism sticks only, I guess, to the most entrenched, accepted, and true versions of the text for an audience that would, it seems, consider gay readings, festooned by our infamous rainbows, as far afield of the proper perspective that should inform a sensible reader who shares a truth that, say, doesn't even feel needs to be named out loud. I have never been that coy in my life and will say it out loud. Let's call this epistemic presumption what it is: compulsory heterosexuality, to borrow the term from Adrienne Rich, which delineates the limits of any so-called sensible understanding of the works themselves or the life of the man who wrote them. Everyone is straight until proven otherwise, as is their artistic output, and the burden of proof is always on the otherwise, never on the presumption that stories and the people who author them are obviously and indisputably heterosexual. And queerness of any sort is at best an occurrent insight that might creep in at the margins, but doesn't matter much in the grand scheme of how sensible responses can make true valuations of art. Of course, what I am describing here has been described before and described far better by Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick in her landmark study, Epistemology of the Closet. This book from over 30 years ago is remarkably pertinent even to our present moment, as far as I'm concerned. And in this book, Sedgwick explicates our modern way of knowing. Gay desire is something that has to be discerned and proven, never as a perspective naturally as valid as the unacknowledged assumptions we make about the knowledge that does find generally unquestioned approval in peer-reviewed journals and academic discourse. Which is to say that if I had written a book titled Straight Faulkner, trying to prove that William Faulkner was a heterosexual, people would look at me like I had grown an extra head. There are just certain premises that we don't even imagine need to be proven. But then going back to my earlier comment about having met many heterosexuals in my life and still being a bit uncertain as to what exactly that means, were I to argue that Faulkner was, gasp, shockingly, a heterosexual, I don't really know what I'd be trying to prove in the first place, nor what intrinsic value it necessarily adds to the text to know that about him. Indeed, if Faulkner is a heterosexual, and his understanding of that identity infuses his works, then I cannot imagine even the most pedestrian reading of any of his novels or short stories convincing anyone that heterosexuality is a very good thing. In fact, the version of it that appears in his writing is almost universally flagrantly white, patriarchal, coercive, violent, misogynistic, to name a few adjectives, even by the most aggressively backward Southern standards, and would hardly position Faulkner as worth the mantle of greatness for a writer from America, from the South, or even just here from little old Mississippi. He surely would not be read as terribly brilliant, but as terribly paradigmatic of his time and place. And not to put too fine a point on it, but Mississippi in the first half of the 20th century is rarely held up as ideal. He would be a museum piece, I think, in this model, indicative of a history best suited to storage next to old flags as relics of an unshifting dead past. Such a state for Faulkner studies is what I would describe as truly moribund. The most succinct way to summarize epistemology of the closet is when Sedgwick asked a series of questions that also became the opening for the recent CFP for last summer's Queer Faulkner Conference. Has there ever been a gay Socrates, a gay Shakespeare, a gay Proust? Sedgwick asked before adding, does the Pope wear a dress? If these questions startle, it is not the least as tautologies. Because yes, there have been, and they were named, wait for it, Socrates, Shakespeare, and Proust. And no, Faulkner does not make Sedgwick's list from epistemology of the closet, but the parameters of traditional Faulkner studies have often fallen into the camp that would answer such critical questions, according to Sedgwick anyway, with the concise denials, either don't ask or you shouldn't know. She subsequently outlines a series of statements used to minimize or dismiss any investment in understanding how gay lives, gay friendships, gay desires, and gay sensibilities influence authorship, even as heterosexuality is framed as the universal constant, the source from which sensible and true knowledge flows. I would rephrase the prose poem of excuses and elisions that Sedgwick lists as a series of binaries, embedded in academic discourse and used as an almost insurmountable barrier to asking the simple question, can there be a gay Faulkner? Notably, this discourse is not only unkind to queer studies, but also, to varying degrees and with each its own Byzantine manifestations, to any marginalized or minoritized group trying to find a seat at the table of the canon. And yeah, to be clear in my comments today, I am arguing that academic discourse, for all of its virtues, is also part of an institution that is itself an ideological state apparatus. As such, its function is to reproduce that which hegemonically suits the interests of the social state of which it is a part. Compulsory heterosexuality and cis identity, and patriarchy and whiteness are all points of privilege that maintain that privilege through the constant reproduction of it. That which is compulsory becomes a compulsiveness to deny other ways of knowing. And piercing that kind of hidebound skin is necessary, but is also always already insensible, unacceptable, subjective, personal, unknowable, and therefore ultimately dismissible, even as the knife edge of that queerness working its way against the leather-bound dogmas of academic discourse retains its sharpness, looking for that one place to make a cut. One example of the hidebound skin of Faulkner studies might be its preference to describe his relationship with his wife Estelle as fated from early childhood and central to his development as an artist who first loses and then regains her at the critical junctures that periodize his early creative outburst and later brilliant creative leaps. Her constant presence, at least in biographical studies of Faulkner, creates a backstop against insinuations that his particular genius was anything other than firmly rooted in and growing out of a heteronormative erotic drive peddling his artistic expression. This is just one example, I might say, of the unquestioned privileging of heterosexual perspectives on his life and work. Gay Faulkner functions as an alternative epistemology. It asks as its central question, what if Faulkner did know about homosexuality, and what if he was at least untroubled by it? Or, maybe more daringly, what if he was influenced by it in myriad ways? You know, since his life parallels key moments in the paradigm shift of the latter 19th and early 20th centuries into homosexuality as we know it, to quote Sedgwick, or the emergence of a version of gay desire and selfhood that we understand as a recognizable mode of being. We are, after all, talking about a man whose interest in arts and literature led to him being labeled, in the Southern colloquial way of saying it, queer, in Oxford as a teenager, and then just outright queer by students on this very campus when he was briefly enrolled here from 1919 to 1920. That time as a UM student is also a key site for inquiry into his self-presentation as it functions as a time when he seemed to be intentionally posturing as part of a courtship not with the young co-ed, but with the young and angelically beautiful Ben Wasson, who I often refer to as like Faulkner's twink, and that's probably inappropriate, but whatever. To whom, by the way, he would read poetry on warm, verdant days in the grove. These labelings coincide with the definitional shift of the word queer to having the homosexual connotations with which we are familiar. In the Oxford English Dictionary, they trace the earliest recorded use of queer as homosexual to 1915, around the time that it was being applied to Faulkner in various settings. And by the way, it doesn't really matter if Faulkner really was queer as in gay, so much as he was called queer as in gay, and does not seem, in accounts of this period collected in interviews and memoirs, to have been terribly troubled by the implications of that. Of course, to dabble in these brief snippets of biography moves us from Gay Faulkner as epistemology towards Gay Faulkner as an archive, including, by the way, unpublished materials in major archives, the removal of which from the published record profoundly shifts the tone of narratives of his life towards the exclusion of gay connections. This exclusion repeats in the presumption that his works must be as devoid of queerness as the desert of his exclusively heterosexual life must have been. Or, if it does appear, it must appear with anxiety and maybe even panic. Sightings of it are novel, modern, and au courant, and never in a good way. The most important critical leap I made in working on what became Gay Faulkner came from the input of my dissertation director, Jamie, you knew you were going to get called out today, Jamie Harker in the back of the room, who insisted for a long, long time that archives are in fact valuable resources, even as I was not quite ready to listen to that advice. I began this project working under the vague epistemological framework that Faulkner is gay because I say he is. And I'm not actually backing away from that, but I have other reasons too. And I was determined to mine queer theory to prove my point. Jamie suggested, and here I'm going to pare down many conversations into what is, as a paraphrase, just, you ever thought about checking out an archive? And after chasing my own tail in circles long enough, I did finally listen. The archive I chose is the L.D. Brodsky collection, housed at Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, which includes a collection called the Blattner Papers. Joseph Blattner was a young professor at the University of Virginia who befriended Faulkner in the 1950s and managed to be named Faulkner's official biographer after Faulkner's death by his widow Estelle. In 1974, Faulkner published a massive 2-volume biography of William Faulkner that felt outright encyclopedic in its scope. Later, in 1984, he published a 1-volume abridged version. This latter version is not just easier to read, but actually also contained new insights and additional information that Blattner was able to gather after the 1974 volume was published, and more people in reading the life came out of the proverbial woodwork to offer additional information on this most famous man. If these two versions can seem so enormous as to be undoubtedly the sum total of Faulkner's life, the third version of the biography are the Blattner Papers, which are comprised of the full collection of his notes for both the 1974 and 1984 biographies. In going through these notes, evidence of a more substantial queer life emerges that did not make it to authorized print. The many details from the Blattner Papers are too voluminous to explore in full here, but to offer one example of how they reframe Faulkner, I will summarize the versions of an interview that Blattner conducted with Monique Lang in the 1950s. In that interview, Lang related a story about going to a dinner party with Faulkner and Tennessee Williams. The key to the story is that when Lang wanted to leave the party with Williams, Faulkner responded, "Go with your queers." What that phrase means, including its weight as a dismissive pejorative, changes into 3 versions of the story, from the original interview notes to how they appear in the 2 published books. Let's see. In the 1984 version, Faulkner and Lang are at a dinner party hosted by Gene Stein. Williams is also there, but the paragraph begins by suggesting that Stein hosted parties large and small, or Faulkner went to parties large and small, and the next sentence being about Stein muddles which parties we are talking about here. It is unclear how many other people were there and how much Faulkner and Williams interacted, except that Williams seemed worshipful and asked Faulkner some question about race in the South, which Faulkner did not appreciate. It appears Hemingway was also there, along with a journalist who would report on Williams then telling Hemingway about Faulkner's terrible, distraught eyes. The 1974 version is somewhat different. First, Williams is not alone. Lang recalls that he was accompanied by a young friend of his from Italy. The syntax for when Williams spoke to Hemingway is also much clearer. It was later, not at this particular party. Then Hemingway later related the story to a journalist. That Lang recalls so much about Williams implies, I think, a more intimate party. But at the end, by the way, Faulkner still tells Lang, "Go with your queers." The original interview notes paint a much more complicated picture. In it, Lang did not relate anything about a later comment Williams made to Hemingway, who later spoke to a journalist. That anecdote is separate, picked up by Blattner from another source, and not necessarily about this incident at all. Williams and Faulkner crossed paths numerous times in the 1950s. Lang's interview does not say a single thing about Faulkner's terrible, distraught eyes, nor Williams noticing them. But she did recall very specifically that Williams and his Italian boyfriend were there, a phrasing that feels much more intimate than just as passing guests at a large party. Williams' question about race in the South clams Faulkner up, and everyone thought it was awkward, suggesting at least that it was an ongoing conversation, possibly at a relatively smaller table. Later, when Lang wants to follow Williams to another party, that's when Faulkner says, "Sure, go with your queers." The erasure of the boyfriend, as well as the intrusion of a possibly unrelated story, obscure the original interaction. So, what changes in the story when we consider the original details? Was Faulkner's apparent homophobia a general response to Williams' presence? A slight that he made in anger when the real challenge was predicated on racial questions posed by a fellow Mississippian? Or was he just joking? Or did the Italian boyfriend have something to do with it? By the way, the Blattner papers elsewhere also relate a story of Faulkner slumming it in Harlem with Carl Van Vechten and his black boyfriend, and nothing in that story suggests that Faulkner was troubled by the boyfriend, though then when they made it to a dance hall where drag king Gladys Bentley was performing, Faulkner tucked tails and ran to the wind. The full record in the Blattner papers, read outside of the narrative imposed on Faulkner's life by Blattner, paints a picture of a man who was not only comfortable around homosexuality, but who actually seemed to surround himself with gay men and seek out gay spaces, such as in New Orleans, where his roommate was the openly gay William Spratlin, and some interview evidence suggests that others just took for granted that Spratlin and Faulkner were a couple. Or in New York, where Faulkner frequented Greenwich Village, and even into the 1950s preferred to stay at the Algonquin Hotel, site of a famous queer-friendly salon, rather than accept offers to stay with his own publishers in their lavish homes. His most endearing lifelong friendship was with that gay best friend of his, Ben Wasson, whom later in the 1950s he actually invited to sit in the Faulkner family pew at Jill's wedding, that'd be Faulkner's daughter. He found solace when he was traveling in northern cities with a group that called themselves the Southern Protection Association, which, from what notes you can infer, seems to have been mostly a group of gay Southern artists up in New York supporting each other with talk about back home while drinking copious amounts of slow-drip coffee. He read gay novelists and seemed to value their work, even as it flirted with explicitly gay desire. He surrounded himself often with gay men with whom he had positive, productive, and genuine friendships, and seemed utterly unflummoxed by their sexuality at all. William Faulkner was a writer who rose to prominence in the world of art, letters, and films in the 1930s to the 1950s, y'all. It should be much more shocking to argue that his works are devoid of or rarely influenced by gay sensibilities or queer desire than it is to say that he was comfortable with gay men, aware of gay desire, sensitive to gay sensibilities, and even aware of his own self-presentation as gay, or at least queer, in both local and later in national settings. Each of these claims can be borne out in the archive as at least equally plausible to most heterosexual assumptions about Faulkner. Each is also predicated on a simple idea that reading for gay desire can be limitless not that it is limited nor limiting. Wedding the epistemological to the archival should make an answer to, can there be a gay Faulkner, seem startling as a tautology. The answer is, I hope, more homecoming than it is leave-taking, not moribund but vital. Can there be a gay Faulkner? Yes, because there can be and always has been gay life even here. But even I know that fundamentally, Gay Faulkner is at last a limitation. To make visible an aspect of his life and an influence on his work, my book explores his relationship to a version of homosexuality that is fundamentally white and male and at least relatively cisgender. I wrote Gay Faulkner. I did not write Queer Faulkner. And while I will defend my choice for so narrow a perspective at the time, on the grounds that even that little bit needed to be said to pierce those hidebound conventions, or at least try to, I also know that my study was effectively obsolete the moment it was printed. We do not need more studies of Faulkner that are white, male, and cisgender. Gay Faulkner offers a fundamentally conservative evaluation of the much revered author. But properly speaking, the future of Faulkner studies is queer, and trans, with a little asterisk beside it, and ace, to the extent that these terms escape the umbrella of queerness, towards a fuller accounting of our lives and the art produced by us. And here I am not using us to refer only to the LGBTQ community, but to everybody, LGBTQ and beyond. In the hyperbole of his review, it was very easy for me to make a straw man out of say for my talk here today, but I will conclude by coming back to him with a different and somewhat less shady critique. He offers that no satisfactory answer to how or why Faulkner's brilliance emerged from his time and place has yet been written, even as many have tried. Now, I am not so arrogant as to say that my attempt any more fully answers this question than the many other attempts by many other brilliant scholars. But I do think that Queer Faulkner, if not Gay Faulkner, is a significant part of the answer, or at least some version of Queer Faulkner is. Faulkner sits at the apex of canons of 20th century American and Southern literatures, as well as possibly world literatures. His creation of an apocryphal space to reflect and refract the realities of actual Mississippi present to us so deftly the paradox of the South as an idea of a place, even as the place doesn't really exist in any stable form. It has, however, birthed a renaissance, or renaissance as we say down here, often periodized, in fact, in reference to the emergence of Faulkner's works. So let's conclude by considering what it means that Faulkner is central to a Southern Renaissance. And for that, I can turn once more to Sedgwick, who writes in Epistemology, "We can't possibly know in advance about the Harlem Renaissance any more than we can about the New England Renaissance or the English and Italian Renaissance, where the limits of a revelatory inquiry are to be set once we begin to ask, and it is now beginning to be asked by each of these renaissances, where and how the power in them of gay desires, people, discourses, prohibitions, and energies were manifest. We know enough already, however, to know with certainty that in each of these renaissances they were central. No doubt that's how we will learn to recognize a renaissance when we see one. Faulkner's enduring queerness is what draws us to him despite the other foibles present in his work because of the time and the place in which he wrote them. The queerness is not marginal, but central, not momentary, but ever present, suffused like rock in a firmament, which I think is a fine and sturdy place to call home. Thank you very much.